Haul the roll and go. Where am I to go? Meet Johnny, where am I to go? For I'm a young and a sailor lad, and where am I to go?
Hello, and welcome to Where Am I to Go podcast. Today, we are at Fort Bayard in Fort Bayard, New Mexico.
That's right.
And this is an old military fort converted into a hospital. We are here with Doug. This area, the drive that we had this morning was absolutely beautiful. We came over from Truth or Consequences up over, what's the name of the pass?
Emory Pass.
Emory Pass. And the drive is just unbelievable. But we get over here, and this is pretty country also. And we're going to talk about Fort Bayard and how it started and all of that kind of stuff. Doug is with us. Welcome, Doug, to Where Am I to Go podcast.
Happy to be with you.
Okay, well, let's get started.
Sure.
At the very beginning.
At the very beginning. All right. Well, of course, this area here was part of the Spanish Empire. Going back into the 1500s, the Spaniards had, of course, conquered the Aztecs in Mexico by about 1521 and had established themselves there. And they kept hearing persistent rumors of gold to be had to the north.
I was just going to ask that. Did the Aztecs, I know that the Spanish raided a lot of the Aztec gold, but were the Aztecs mining here at that point in time?
Not to our knowledge. They were not anywhere close to this area. They were farther south.
Okay, but this area is really rich in gold and silver.
Well, it was much more rich in other minerals, but enough gold to attract settlers eventually.
Okay, and so where were the Aztecs getting their gold from? I've never gone down this rabbit hole, so I guess you're going to go for a ride.
Well,
with me.
there were mines in the region to the north of Mexico City, especially, and in fact, silver mines became very famous in the Zacatecas region.
Okay,
but they found enough gold in that area, and the Aztecs had accumulated it. To the extent that the Spaniards figured if there's that much here, there's bound to be more elsewhere.
Okay.
So when they kept hearing these stories about these fantastic golden cities that existed somewhere to the north, that was enough to encourage exploration in this direction.
Okay.
And so the Spaniards had actually come up the Rio Grande, starting in the mid-1500s. And they didn't find the gold that they wanted, but they did find Indian cultures that they dropped off missionaries as they came. There's the old saying that the Spanish came with the sword in one hand and the cross in the other.
Okay.
And so as they began to discover the presence of these Indian cultures, they thought part of their mission was to introduce them to Christianity. So the Spaniards had begun leaving off missionaries in the region, and for decades, the main purpose the Spaniards had in revisiting the region was to check on the missionaries that they had left behind, most of whom were martyred fairly soon after the soldiers left. But in
kind of a rough life.
It was. The first permanent Spanish settlement in New Mexico was established in 1598.
Okay.
And that was a group that came up under the leadership of a fellow named Juan de Oñate. And Oñate, in fact, was a wealthy man who had become rich in silver mining in Mexico. And he got permission from the Spanish government to establish a colony along the Rio Grande, and that colony was near where the present town of Española, New Mexico.
Okay, that's north of Santa Fe.
North of Santa Fe.
Okay.
This region, where we are in southwest New Mexico, was not settled early by the Spanish because of the presence of the Apaches.
Okay.
The Apache culture were never defeated by the Spanish. And in fact, they would never be defeated by the Mexicans that will succeed the Spanish. Now, very near Fort Bayard here, just a few miles to the east of us, about 5 miles away, was a major copper deposit.
Okay.
And standing here, we can look off to the east, and we see a very distinctive bluff.
Oh, yeah.
On the horizon. And locally, that bluff is known as the Kneeling Nun.
Okay. And why is that?
Well, if there is a major bluff, and then separate from the bluff, but very visible from our angle, is a large stone monolith.
Okay.
And the legend is that monolith is a nun, the remains of a nun who had broken her vows with a Spanish soldier.
Uh-oh.
And in punishment, she had been turned to stone.
Okay.
Well, at the base of that bluff is one of the world's largest copper deposits.
Really?
They are still mining there today. The Freeport-McMoran Company today owns the property, and it's a massive open pit mine.
Okay, and that's visible from here.
Yes. And but they started mining there, extracting copper there as early as 1803.
Really?
And Spaniards from Mexico, of course, this was part of Mexico then, so we should say from farther south in Mexico, had come up and with the permission, basically, of the Apaches, began to extract copper there, and in return, they provided trade goods to the Apaches for being allowed to extract the copper.
Which later turned around to bite them in the butt when the Apaches had guns and...
Of course,
okay.
Yes. and in 1821, Mexico won its independence. They had a revolt that went on for several years, and similar to the U.S., birth of the U.S. Away from Britain, the same thing happens. Mexico rebels against Spain and wins its independence in 1821. The first English-speaking people we know of in this area were fur trappers.
Okay.
Who had come down from northern New Mexico, particularly the area around Taos in northern New Mexico, is known for mountain men and fur trapping.
Right.
And they had heard rumors of large populations of beaver who were present on the Gila River drainage in this region.
Okay.
So they came down in 1824. There was a fellow by the name of Sylvester Patty. And Patty and his son, James Ohio Patty, and in the company of several others, came down and indeed did trap beaver successfully on the Gila River. And they found a lot of beaver and a lot more Apaches. And the Apaches were not particularly friendly to the presence of these trappers, so they decided it was in their best interest to keep moving west. And they eventually go all the way out to San Diego. And in fact, you can visit the grave of Sylvester Patty today in San Diego, very near Balboa Park.
Okay.
But anyway, in the process, they discovered this mining operation over here. And by the way, the Spanish name for that mine was Santa Rita.
Okay.
Santa Rita del Cobre. Cobre is Spanish for copper.
Thank you for that interpretation, because I had no clue.
Yeah. And so anyway, they were so impressed that some of the trappers actually bought a share of the mine.
Okay.
There. And that eventually led to some Americans showing up there at the mine to work, one of whom was a young Kit Carson.
Now, Kit Carson ended up settling in Taos, correct?
That's correct.
Yeah, okay.
He originally was from Missouri, but as a teenager, he had run away from his post as a apprentice in a tanning business. decided there had to be something better in life than that. And he had ended up in New Mexico and worked briefly in the late 1820s at Santa Rita.
Okay.
And as a result, became familiar with this area. Fast forward to the 1830s. The mine is shut down because of warfare that breaks out with the Apaches. The Mexican government had started paying bounties for Apache scalps. And that had attracted a certain type of entrepreneur to the Southwest, and you had scalp hunters. The scalp hunting, needless to say, drove a big wedge between the Apaches and the Mexicans.
Okay, now was scalp collecting an Indian thing, or was it a white thing as a bounty?
Well, scholars argue about that to this day as to where it originated. Was it truly introduced by Europeans, as some people suggest, or was scalp hunting already present long before they saw Europeans? And I don't know the answer to that. I know there's a debate about.
Well, I know it's always associated with the Indians.
Yes,
but it's interesting to hear that the whites were collecting them.
Yeah.
Other than, I knew that there were mountain men that had done that just because, but I always figured it was an Indian carryover.
And as a result of it, basically the local Apaches said, well, that's it for the mine. We're not putting up with these guys here anymore. And so the mine was forced to shut down. And meanwhile, the U.S. and Mexico will go to war in 1846 over boundary disputes in Texas primarily. But the United States, in developing a military strategy to defeat Mexico, invaded New Mexico, which was the northernmost province of Mexico. Invaded New Mexico by way of the Santa Fe Trail. Now, the Santa Fe Trail had been developed as a merchant's route between Missouri and Santa Fe in the 1820s. Spain had prohibited trade with the United States, but Mexico legalizes it.
Okay.
And
I thought the Santa Fe Trail was a lot older than that.
No, its birthday is basically 1821.
Huh. Okay.
Yeah.
I was thinking that it had been used for hundreds of years, not just a couple hundred years. But that's cool. I learned something.
And so the American Army that came down the Santa Fe Trail from Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, was called the Army of the West. And the Army of the West was under the command of Stephen Watts Kearny. And they were under orders to seize New Mexico. And then, if that went well, then they were to proceed on to the west to California.
Okay.
And so New Mexico fell basically without a shot. And Santa Fe was seized in the summer of 1846. Kearny, in charge of the army, now will continue on toward California. But he really didn't know how to get there. What was the best way to go? So they started south along the Rio Grande, wondering where they should turn west.
Okay.
And they eventually ran into a small party of men headed eastward near the current day community of Socorro, New Mexico.
Okay.
And among those men that the Army meets is Kit Carson. Carson had been in California with John C. Fremont.
Okay.
And had helped overturn the Mexican government there. Fremont had given Carson documents to be delivered to Washington, to President Polk.
Okay.
And Carson is on his way to fulfill that mission when he runs into Kearny's army coming down the Rio Grande. Kearney said, you're the famous explorer and mountain man Kit Carson, and you know how to get to California, so I want you to take us to California. And Carson said, well, would love to, but I got this other mission. I'm on my way to the east. And Kearney says, you know what? I'm a general, and you're going to do this for me. So Carson had to give in and agree to send the papers on with somebody else and turn around and head straight back to California as the guide for the Army.
Okay.
And that's how the Army passes through this area. Because Carson said the best way to get to California from the Rio Grande is to cut across these mountains that will become known as the Black Range.
Okay.
And
now, is there a better pass than Emery Pass?
In fact, there was, and Emery Pass is named for Lieutenant William Emery,
okay,
who was one of the topographical engineers, map makers, if you will, who was with Kearney's army.
Okay.
And Emery Pass is named for him, but that's not where the army came through. The army actually came several miles south of Emery Pass across much lower, easier traveling mountains.
Okay, because I was going to say that pass it does not seem like it would be fun to take wagons, cannons, or anything.
Right,
over.
And by that time, by the way, they didn't have any wagons. They had started out with wagons, and Carson said, these aren't going to work, not where we're going.
Okay.
And so Kearney had sent the wagons back, and they switched over to pack mules.
Okay.
And one of the places Kearney's army stops, with Carson leading them, is the mine at Santa Rita. And Emery and the other topographical engineers were taking notes on the landscape, the geology, the potential of this region for future development by the United States.
Okay.
And so their reports would eventually be very encouraging to bring miners to this area. They met with the local Apaches in this area. There's a place about 20 miles to the northwest of where we're at the moment, a place called Mangus Springs today.
Okay.
And Mangus Springs is named for Mangus Coloradus, who was the Apache leader in the 1840s in this area.
Okay.
And they met there with Kearney. The Apaches were thrilled to hear that somebody else was in the business of killing Mexicans. And the Apaches offered an alliance with the Americans against the Mexicans, and even asked for guns from the American Army to help. And Kearney thought that over briefly and decided that wasn't a good idea, and so they didn't enter into any formal alliance, but they sort of made temporary peace that we won't bother you as we travel through your country, and we'd appreciate it if you didn't bother us.
Right.
And so that was kind of how they left it as they got on. But eventually, the United States, of course, will go on to defeat Mexico completely in the Mexican War. And in 1848, a treaty was signed called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo.
Okay.
And the important part of that treaty for us is that Mexico had to give up about 50% of its territory to the United States. And that includes the ground on which we're standing.
Okay.
By the time the Senate got around to ratifying it, it was 2 years later. But officially, in 1850, the U.S. now owns this territory. And in order to begin to have settlers, miners, travelers through the area, military protection was going to be necessary. And so the Army decided to build a system of forts across their newly acquired territory. it wasn't yet time for Fort Bayard. Fort Bayard was still a few years in the future. But the first fort in this area was right over there at the copper mine, and they called it Fort Webster.
Okay.
Named after Daniel Webster, the Secretary of State.
He was also a dictionary dude, wasn't he?
Rather famous for some of that, yes.
I didn't even know about the Secretary of State thing. I just thought he was the guy that I had to read the dictionary out of.
And unfortunately, in this case, his namesake fort was not well suited location-wise for water. And so they decide very quickly they got to have a different spot for the fort. So they move it 15 miles to the east along the Mimbres River.
Okay.
And called it Fort Webster No. 2. And it was better for water, but now it's too far from the mines to be of any immediate assistance when they need help. So the Army...
This isn't government planning, is it?
I'm afraid it is.
I'm glad they left that all way behind.
And glad it's so much more efficient now.
Yes.
Well, as the old saying that military intelligence is a contradiction in terms. But at any rate, the Army will try several other locations for forts in the area, none of which last very long. And then we have this little interruption in things called the Civil War, which comes along in 1861. By the way, the Butterfield Trail had been established in 1858, and it ran just to the south of us, a few miles between here and Deming, New Mexico. And so you're going to have travelers moving along the Butterfield Trail, even though they don't keep the trail for very many years as far as moving mail, because the railroads are coming.
And where did the Butterfield Trail end?
The Butterfield Trail actually ended in California.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it went all the way across to Arizona.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And so any forts in this area will soon have the additional obligation of protecting the trail. Is why we need to be sure we know that.
Right.
Now, as far as New Mexico in the Civil War, most of the troops were withdrawn, of course, to fight in the east. But they left a skeleton-sized force in New Mexico, which then tempted the Confederacy to take over New Mexico, and particularly because it would open the way to California. It would also open access to Colorado and the gold fields in the Pikes Peak region of Colorado. So
now was New Mexico a state at that point?
No,
it was a territory.
It was a territory. In fact, would remain a territory until 1912.
Okay, and it was part of it was its own territory with its boundaries kind of like they are now, or was it part of Arizona and a larger area for a territory?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the original New Mexico territory included what is today the state of Arizona, plus the southern quarter of Colorado.
Okay, and its headquarters for the territory was in Santa Fe?
It was in Santa Fe.
Okay.
Yeah, and Arizona territory was not separated from New Mexico until 1863.
Okay.
During the Civil War. But as part of the fighting in the Civil War, the Confederates invaded New Mexico from Texas. Texas was part of the Confederacy.
Right.
And an invading army came up in 1862 from El Paso and won their first engagements and advanced all the way up until they ran into the Union forces north of Santa Fe. And by that time, the Union forces had been reinforced from Colorado. The Colorado Volunteers had decided that if the Confederates are going to invade Colorado, let's go fight them in New Mexico. And so they had come down, and in an engagement that lasted for about 3 days, the Union Army was able to destroy all of the Confederates' supplies.
Wow.
And so they were left basically stranded in New Mexico, and they had no choice but to retreat. In the meantime, the Union, scrambling to bring more personnel into New Mexico, had recruited a volunteer army in California, which was remaining loyal to the Union. And this group was known as the California Column. And they came across in the summer of 1862, coming across southern Arizona into this region of New Mexico. And by the time they got here, the Confederates had already been expelled.
Okay.
And so the California Column had no Confederates to fight, so instead they fought the Indians.
I'm sure it was a disappointment to find out that there was nobody to fight, so they were anxious for it.
Yeah, they were. And in fact, they had been ambushed by the Apaches in their way across southern Arizona, a place called Apache Pass, which is after that scrape.
Is that close to Apache Junction?
No, it's
Okay.
quite a ways south.
I knew that there was another Apache.
The place that is there today is Fort Bowie, and Fort Bowie National Monument.
Okay, I have not been there.
That's a must go.
And where is it located?
You go along I-10 until you get about to Bowie, the town of Bowie, and then take the exit there that will take you out to the historic site.
I'll have to check that out next time I'm going through that way.
Very interesting place.
Okay.
And very historic. And anyhow, the Army got here, and they said, we've got to have a fort in this area. And they tried one about 30 miles northwest of us, but it's the same old story. They were too far away from where they were needed. And so orders went out from the Army to find a place that is watered and located centrally to the mining operations.
Okay.
And that's how they came to choose the spot we are standing on. There are 19 freshwater springs between this spot and the mountains a few miles to the north of us.
Wow.
And all of those springs are at a higher elevation, so they could transfer water by using gravity
Right.
down to this spot.
So they built a water line as far as
Yes.
underground, or
It was above ground.
it was above ground?
Yeah.
And did they use what kind of pipe did they use? Was it the old wood pipe that swelled up and sealed up, or did they build a brick or adobe type? Let me come on over here where you're at so we can get this.
In 1866, they had channels built down through the mountains.
Like canals.
Canals, small
Okay.
canals.
This
And
is
then
Ansel, by the way.
Oh, this is Ansel. You told me about Ansel.
Yeah.
I hope that was good.
It was. He said the guy that's probably the smartest around here was you. So
Yeah, right.
I'm going to have to go with
That's
that.
not even close. Anyway, so in about 1920s, 1911, right in there, they started using metal pipe and some clay pipe to conduct water.
Okay.
But in those pipes, you can still see if you walk back in through there, how they hooked up all the springs. And
Okay.
of course, that water still flows by gravity. They have 3 gigantic reservoirs, pipes or water towers that you'll see just up here
Okay.
to the north. And they still use those. In fact, they have to run water out of those because they don't have any way to turn off the water. It comes by gravity. So when they get full, they got to empty it out.
Right.
So sometimes you'll come through here and see water running running over every place you can imagine, just because they got to empty all that water out, or the water towers have problems
Okay.
structurally.
That's interesting. Yeah, I've been to different places where they have wood pipes.
Right.
And, you know, the wood swells, and I just always have found those totally fascinating, that you could take and cut those on the bevel
Yeah.
like a barrel.
Yeah,
and,
like a book.
Yeah.
They'll swell up and
and
stop
get 'em to
leaking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just, it's a fascinating thing as to how they moved stuff back then.
But they didn't have wood pipes at that time here. They always had a canal. And then later, in the early 1800s or the early 1900s, they put in the pipes.
Yeah,
And
the
those are
canals
metal
make sense.
pipes.
Yeah.
And those were metal pipes. Some clay pipes, red clay pipes.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The canal, that wasn't even in my thought of options, but that's the one that makes the most sense.
Yeah, for the early days.
Yeah.
And this fort would be called Fort Bayard because a general by the name of George D. Bayard had been killed in the Battle of Fredericksburg in the Civil War, and his name had gone on a list of people to be memorialized by having the next military post that's established will be named after people on this list. And when it was time to name this spot, his name was at the top of the list. So George D. Bayard never set foot in New Mexico.
But he lives here now.
And never been west of the Mississippi.
Actually, I think he had been in Kansas at one time. Yeah.
And turned around and went back home.
But the first soldiers here arrived in August of 1866, and they were Company B of the 125th Colored Infantry.
So the Buffalo soldiers.
The Buffalo soldiers, and they had marched here. These were infantrymen who had marched here from Fort Union, 300 miles to the north of us. And they got here and were told, throw up a fort. So they started building structures that were pretty poor, pretty ramshackle. And one of the things you notice from the primary sources of people who passed through Fort Bayard in those early years is they loved the location, they loved the environment, they hated the buildings.
Okay.
The buildings were poor, they were drafty, they were leaky, they were cold. Cold buildings is obviously a tradition here.
Did they use wood or
Yes.
from the forests around here?
Wood and stone.
But they didn't do a lot of
Eventually
adobe. I was
They,
going to
they
say,
will rebuild it later with adobe.
because I see a lot of adobe around here.
Yes.
Yes.
And one of the reasons it was so poorly built at first is the Army wasn't sure they were going to keep the fort.
Okay.
And in fact, they went so far as the first burials that were in the local cemetery. We have just up the hill from our spot here is Fort Bayard National Cemetery, which is one of only 2 national cemeteries in New Mexico.
Okay.
And today it has almost 5,000 burials. But the very first burials there no longer have any remains in them. And that's because about 1870, the Army said, we think we're going to close Fort Bayard, and we're going to keep Fort Cummings, which is about 35 miles south of us near Deming.
Okay.
And so they gave orders to transfer the remains of the soldiers at Fort Bayard down to Fort Cummings. So they had no sooner gotten that done than the Army said, you know what, we changed our mind. We're going to keep Bayard and close Cummings.
Oh, boy.
So now they had to move the remains of the soldiers at Fort Cummings, but they didn't bring them back to Fort Bayard. They took them to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. So as a result, we have grave markers here in our cemetery for that there's nothing there. Okay,
That's
but
unbelievable.
in the meantime, the Army lost the paperwork between the transfer from Cummings to Leavenworth, and so those men are no longer identified where their remains actually are. So they're memorialized here. even though their remains aren't here. So,
Well, I guess that's better than not knowing anything
exactly, exactly. All right, so Fort Bayard then became an active military post until 1899. None of the buildings that currently stand here today date from that era.
Okay.
All of the buildings that remain here today are from the later medical period.
Okay, and these are some really cool buildings. Driving in here, it's an impressive drive in.
Yes.
The buildings are more of a colonial style, I would say.
Well, the Army had a particular blueprint, let's say, for
Okay.
buildings from this era. And I've been to other locations around the country, for example, Fort Robinson, Nebraska, the Presidio in San Francisco.
Okay.
When you drive into them, you say, oh my gosh, there's what Fort Bayard used to look like. And the buildings are cut from the same plan, basically. Okay. And where we're at today, these buildings came into existence between 1905 and 1911. In 1899, when the Army decided they no longer needed Fort Bayard as an active military post, and I should point out that it had remained a key post in the Apache Wars, which ended in 1886.
Okay.
And about the most soldiers that were ever here would have been around the time of the Victoria War in 1880, when there were around 700 or 800 soldiers here. Many of them were cavalry, and Fort Bayard was a very important post in the history of the Buffalo Soldiers. The black soldiers, 9th and 10th Cavalry, were here. Especially the 9th was here in the 1870s and early 80s.
It seems like a lot of the posts down here in the South, well, even in the North, had Buffalo Soldiers.
Yes.
You wouldn't have thought that there would be that many black enlisted that early in the development of these states. And the thing that's really kind of interesting also is when you had that many black soldiers at all of these different bases, or forts, we don't have a black population in these states now.
Right.
I mean, primarily white in Wyoming, Montana, New Mexico, Arizona. I guess Arizona's got quite a few blacks, but still they're primarily white states. And it seems like a lot of these forts were primarily Buffalo soldiers.
Mm-hmm. Well, you got to remember, after the Civil War, President Grant realized that during the Civil War, the Indians had taken over the West again, because all the military had pretty much gone back east.
Okay.
So his problem was he needed to develop an army to come out here and get this, quote, Indian problem under control. Well, most of the white soldiers didn't want to stay in the army. They wanted to go home after the Civil War to their farms and ranches and businesses. So Grant had commanded colored troops and realized how good they were. So he developed the 9th Cavalry and the 24th Infantry of ex-slaves out of Louisiana, Kentucky, and Georgia. And then he went to the Ohio Valley and did the same thing with the 10th Cavalry and the 24th Infantry, trained them and marched them out here. But they weren't just here. They were all throughout the West, all of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, North and South Dakota, Kansas, Nebraska, Texas, Oklahoma. They were instrumental in getting this Indian problem under control so the Americans could move into this country and colonize it.
Yeah, and that's what I've noticed in visiting.
Yeah, there are thousands of these soldiers, but that was a good deal. They could Grant could hire a good army man, a colored army man, for $16 a month, give him a horse and a saddle, feed, food and water, and an opportunity to see the West. And they took advantage of it. That was a great deal for them.
Yeah,
Deal for the country.
It's just kind of strange to me that we don't have bigger settlements of blacks in these areas.
In this area, that's right. But I suppose after the wars, they decided to move back where they're more native to, in the southern parts of the country.
Yeah.
It's very interesting that they didn't stay.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry to have interrupted again.
No problem.
Another rabbit hole. I'm good for those. But that explains a lot of something that I've wondered, because I've always wondered, every fort you go to has a buffalo soldier
But they
display.
were instrumental to the West, to the development of the West.
I see
And
that
people
now.
don't realize that, how important they were.
Well, maybe they will now.
Well, sooner or later they'll figure it out.
One of the things I'd like to mention is that among the most famous personages that ever set foot on Fort Bayard soil was John J. Pershing, who went on, of course, to be the commanding general of all U.S. forces in World War I
Right.
in France. And this was Pershing's first post out of West Point. He graduated in the class of 1886, and he was sent out to join the 6th Cavalry. And his first duty station was right here at Fort Bayard. I know our friends over at Fort Stanton have a bronze plaque that boasts that they were the first station for Pershing. Unfortunately, just because you put it in bronze doesn't make it true.
And I think we probably talked about that at Fort Stanton.
Fort Stanton.
Because we did a podcast at Fort Stanton last year. Again, Buffalo soldiers were there,
Yep.
and both of these forts seem to have a lot in common. I realized some other things as we talk. We'll talk about the TB hospital and
Right.
some of that. And I don't know if you guys were as repurposed. We'll have to talk about that a little bit as
yes.
Fort Stanton. But every time we turned around when I was talking to Javier over there, it was a World War II prisoner of war camp. It was a women's prison. It was I was floored. Everything was in that space.
You know, and in terms of Pershing, of course, everybody knows what his nickname was, Blackjack.
Okay.
And he's called Blackjack because eventually he was transferred from the 6th Cavalry to the 10th. And the 10th Cavalry was a Buffalo Soldier regiment.
Okay.
And by the time he served in Cuba with them in the Spanish-American War in 1898, he had won the nickname Blackjack because of his association with the black soldiers.
Wow. I did not realize that.
Yeah. And
So-
of course, he's back in this neck of the woods in 1916 chasing Pancho Villa.
Okay.
Down along the Mexican border. But moving on, in 1899, the Army decides they don't need Fort Bayard anymore as an active military post. And so that decision came at the same moment that the Army was looking for a place to start a tuberculosis hospital. Now, tuberculosis was the nation's leading disease and cause of death by 1900. And as a result, the treatment regimen for tuberculosis did not include any drug therapy until after World War II. So the way you attempted to treat patients with the disease was to have them go to a dry climate, preferably at a higher elevation because the TB germ it thrives on oxygen. And so if you could go to thinner air, that would be better.
Right.
And you would get rest and a special diet. And so Fort Bayard seemed to fit the needs of the treatment regimen at the time. Here's a spot in a relatively dry area with at a higher elevation. And you had a physical plant in place. And so the Army says Fort Bayard's going to be our tuberculosis hospital.
Okay, can we back up just a little
Sure.
bit? We got into this with Javier over at Fort Stanton, and I'd like to revisit it just because it's so mind-boggling to me. The special diet. When you think of a special diet, you think of the Mediterranean diet or the keto diet or whatever, but this special diet was unbelievable. He had said, and correct me or add to it all you'd like, that TB was known as consumption.
Yes.
And the reason is your body would consume itself if you weren't eating a special diet. And the special diet was 4,000 calories a day with not much physical movement, which is just mind-boggling to me. You'd think that you'd be 10,000 pounds by the end of the year, but
I know here at Fort Bayard, we have a book we sell in our gift shop that's called Ping Pong Balls and Donkey's Milk. And I can tell you later about the ping pong balls if you'd like. But
yes.
But the donkey's milk was part of the special diet, and because they found that for TB patients, donkey milk was more nutritious than regular cow's milk, or at least they believed it to be at that time. They also ate a lot of raw eggs.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and the ping pong balls, by the way, where that comes in is one of the therapies that was tried in the early 1900s was they would actually insert ping pong balls into the lung, doing one lung at a time for the patient. The ping pong balls would keep the lung from being able to expand and contract, so it would be forced rest, if you will, for the lung. And so the person would get by on the other lung while the one was at rest. And then they could withdraw those ping pong balls.
How would they withdraw them?
Through an incision in the thoracic cavity.
Whoa!
But anyway, yeah. And when the doctors got here in 1899, they soon began to grumble about the physical plant, that the buildings were not suited to their needs. So a gentleman by the name of George Bushnell arrived here as the commanding doctor in 1904.
Okay.
And Bushnell was world famous as a expert on the treatment of TB. As a result of his prominence, he had a lot of pull in Washington, and he was able to persuade the Army to rebuild Fort Bayard as a medical facility.
Okay.
And that's when the buildings that are out here today came into being. And we're standing on the porch today of one of the buildings that was built in 1911. This building was the commanding doctor's house. George Bushnell was the first commanding doctor to live in this house.
Okay.
He and his wife, Ethel, had no children, but they had this big house, 3 stories with lots of space. And as a result, it became also kind of the VIP hotel for the hospital. And so when people of import visited the fort, they oftentimes would be guests of the Bushnells.
Okay.
Here in this house. Now, it remains the Army's tuberculosis hospital, Fort Bayard does, until 1920.
Okay.
At that time, the Army decides they're going to transfer their main facility to Denver. And at that time, they handed over the complex here to the U.S. Health Service, which had it for only 2 years, and then they transferred it to the brand new agency that today we call the Veterans Administration.
Okay.
In those days, it was called the Veterans Bureau. But at any rate, it became a VA facility, and they built a state-of-the-art hospital building, which was torn down about 6 years ago.
Okay.
And it sat just to our south here. And they peaked out at about 1,500 patients here. And all of these facilities along this row were occupied by physicians, so it became known as Doctor's Row.
It must have been a pretty good sized facility to have 15 physicians.
Well, and they had, in fact, they had a population here at Fort Bayard of over 3,000.
Oh, really?
Yes. And by the time you count staff, patients, doctors, etc., they had their own dairy herd, 100 milk cows.
Really?
They had their own gardens, their own fruit orchard. They even had a golf course right up the hill from us.
Really?
And,
That's amazing.
and in fact, one of the big events here occurred in 1923 when Pershing, who was by that time probably the most famous living American,
Right.
returned here to preside over the ceremony dedicating the Sojourners Club. The Sojourners Club was a Masonic organization. It was a military Masonic organization.
Okay.
And Pershing was a Mason.
Okay.
So it was quite the big event locally to have Pershing back in town. And even though he was only here for a few hours before he went
He
on,
still was here.
he was back here. Yeah. So remained a VA facility until the mid 1960s. And in 1965, the VA closed down the federal operation here, and they sold the entire property to the state of New Mexico. And today the state owns all of the property here at Fort Bayard. The village of Santa Clara, across the highway from us to our south, came into being as a town to serve Fort Bayard. It became known in the frontier days as what the Army soldiers referred to as a hog ranch.
Okay.
And it was a place where soldiers could get all the things that they thought they needed. Some of which was legitimate, but included all kinds of other businesses such as gambling houses, saloons, and bordellos.
Right.
But today it's, and by the way, the Army called that place Central City.
Okay.
But today it's known by its original Spanish name of Santa Clara. And the village of Santa Clara's village government has a lease today over a 99-year lease over a significant portion of the historic core of Fort Bayard, including this building where we're standing right now, as leased by the village, and our historical organization then subleases the space here for the museum from the village.
Okay. And so you're a 501c3?
We are.
You are? Okay.
Yes.
And so you take donations if people want to donate?
We absolutely do, yes.
Cool.
Yeah, we're a 100% volunteer organization, and our purpose in existing is to keep the story of Fort Bayard alive.
Now, when did these houses all become vacant?
2006. In 2006, at that time, staff that worked at, when it became a state-owned property, the hospital became a state hospital for long-term care, primarily for economically disadvantaged people. And the staff occupied these houses. But in 2006, the state of New Mexico said, we think there's too much lead paint and asbestos in those structures, and we think you need to move out. So at that time, folks left, and the old hospital building was replaced by a new hospital building, which stands about a mile south of us. You drive past it on your way in
right,
the facility. And so at that time, all the utilities were cut off out here, so we no longer have running water and electricity to any building except the one across the parade ground in the theater building, which we usually have open for visitors, but we don't right now because it's undergoing renovation. We are going to get electricity in this building in the next few months.
Well, good.
We hope.
But so are these other houses? You've got how many houses coming down here? And these are monster houses, 3-story. They all look the same, kind of a colonial style. You've got what, probably 10 of them? on this row?
On this row, there are, I want to say there are 8.
8. Okay. I
Yeah.
just was guessing. And they're kind of set up like duplexes, I would
Right.
assume.
The one that we're at today, the museum, is the only single family dwelling. All the rest are either duplexes or even quadruplexes.
Okay. And are they in really bad disrepair? Or, I mean, if they were just vacated in 2006, you wouldn't think that in 20 years that they would have deteriorated beyond fairly easy restoration.
That you're correct. Generally they're in fairly good condition. Of course, the longer they sit vacant, the worse it gets. One of the goals is that the village has is to attract investors, grants, etc., to get people interested in spending money to bring these back into repair.
That would be so cool.
And the big administration building that sits at the north end of the parade ground, the U.S. Forest Service has indicated an interest in occupying that building.
Okay.
And part of the plan is that if the Forest Service eventually gets in there, they'll be paying a lease, a substantial lease.
Right.
And the money will go back into helping upgrade some of these other structures.
That would be awesome.
And we have finally gotten some support from the New Mexico legislature as well, that has appropriated some money to begin stabilizing some of the buildings.
Well, cool. Well, do you mind taking me through the museum a little bit? You've got a museum here, and let's take a look at some of your prized pieces or some that have some interesting backstories.
Sure.
Maybe a couple of ping pong balls that have been extracted from lungs or something like that.
Let me see if Dr. Bill is here.
Okay. That would be good.
Dr. Bill is our medical expert. He's a retired physician. John? Yeah. Would you have a minute to talk with him about some of the items in the museum?
I certainly will.
One
second.
Yeah.
I've got something to talk to you too.
Yes, I will.
Okay. Okay. Hi, folks.
Hi.
How are you?
Good. This is, by the way, this is John and Cecilia Bell. They are some of the original founders of our organization and deserve a tremendous amount of credit for keeping things going out here.
And you said he was one of the doctors here?
Well, he can tell you about that.
We'll ask him. Why don't I take your microphone? And then I'll give it to Dr. John here.
All right.
And then we'll get back together here when we finish things out.
All right.
Okay. I don't know if you know what's going on, John, or not, but I've got a podcast that I do called Where Am I to Go? And I'm here talking about the facilities and stuff. Would you mind sticking that on your lapel so that we can maybe hear you?
Okay.
You want to...
There. Maybe that'll work.
I hope that'll work. Talk a little bit loud if you could.
Okay. Maybe I can just hold it.
You could just hold it. That'd work too, yes.
Okay. Yeah, I'm John Bell, and I'm one of the tour guides here at Fort Bayard. I was, you're welcome to listen to us if you want to. I came here as a physician in 1973, and I was a physician in private practice until 2008.
Okay.
And then in 2008, I came over and worked at Fort Bayard at the old hospital for 2 years the what had been the Veterans Hospital for 2 years. And then in 2010, that moved up on the hill as you come in. And I worked at that hospital till about 2017,
Wow. So you're not that long retired.
about 6 years.
Wow.
I worked as a physician here in Silver City for about 45 years, 10 of it at Fort Bayard.
Wow. Okay. And so you were real instrumental in helping get all these displays and everything started here?
Yes, but that was separate from the being a physician.
Right.
But some of them, and then my wife helped with quite a bit of that as well.
Okay. Well, show us some of your pieces here and talk to us a little bit about what all you've got here in the museum.
Okay. This is a picture of Lieutenant Fulton, and he graduated from West Point in 1886.
Okay.
He came here a few years later as a lieutenant. He went to Silver City to a dance, walked as you would in those days, returned here, caught in a rainstorm, caught pneumonia, and died when he was in his mid-20s.
Oh, geez.
And his body was shipped back east. He had a sweetheart, but no children, no wife. And his belongings were handed down through several generations, and some of his descendants gave this picture to us about 10 or 15 years ago.
Wow.
This is his picture from West Point.
Okay. And it's a colored portrait.
Right. And his West Point ring and some of his other West Point belongings are in the visitor center.
Oh, okay. Now, is the visitor center the museum, or is it different than the museum?
The visitor center is different, and it's in the armory.
Oh, okay.
This is a picture of Colonel George Bushnell.
Okay.
He was the commander here from 1904 to 1917 when it was the U.S. Army Tuberculosis Hospital. Bushnell graduated from Yale in the 1870s, and he then went to medical school and interned at in New York City at a German hospital. He came down with tuberculosis while he was an intern. 5% of the physicians died before they finished their training at that time from tuberculosis.
Wow.
And many nurses as well. He was in the Army for about 20 years in the West. He went back east during the Cuban War, broke down with TB again, was off work 6 months, re-entered the Army, went to Fort Carson, Colorado, and came here in 1903. At one time, there were 9 physicians here, 5 of whom had had tuberculosis themselves. Tuberculosis was the leading cause of death in this country in 1900.
Okay.
And many of the nurses died as well.
Huh. And so a lot of the doctors and the nurses that were working here were actually working with tuberculosis while they were trying to help the patients.
That became controversial later on, but at that time they said there was no reason why a tubercular doctor couldn't work as a doctor and treat patients.
Huh. That's interesting.
That thinking broke down in the 1930s and 40s after the TB Center for the Army moved from here to Fitzsimmons in Denver.
Okay.
This piece of furniture dates back to the 1890s, and it's the only piece of furniture that we have that dates back to when it was a fort.
Okay, and this is one of those parlor seats with the big mirror, the coat hangers on both sides, so when you came in, you could take off your shoes. I'm assuming take off your shoes, your coat, and...
I don't know about shoes, but it was before closets.
Okay, before closets.
Right, you could hang your coats.
And there was the bench seat lifts up.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, I need more than that.
Okay.
Whoa, we need another box.
And then we come over here to the dining room.
This was the dining room.
And is most of these furnishings still original to the building, or?
Yes, but they're from a later date.
Okay.
These original, but when it was a veterans hospital in the 1920s and 30s.
Okay.
Now, the plates, these were not actually used at Fort Bayard, but the women have bought these on eBay mostly, and you can see the medical caduceus, and this is the exact kind of plates that they would have used during the TB era.
Okay. Yeah, they've got the little medical symbol with
Right.
snakes climbing up the shaft.
That's correct.
Right. And it's on all of the servingware.
It's on all the servingware.
Gravy dish and the cream dish and the cups and everything. Wow.
And the chairs are original, but it's been reupholstered.
Right. And you've got a buffet in here and several other dining room type things.
And this is not directly related to Fort Bayard, but I always show this picture. This is a picture of the rodeo in Silver City, near where the high school is now, from 1937.
Okay.
And there's a few things unique here. You see a few women, and the women competed against the men at that time, and they didn't have separate dainty races,
Okay.
but they participated in the same races as the men, and usually the ranching women whipped the men.
I could see that happening.
Now, this is a little different. This man died during the rodeo. He was a clown.
Okay.
They didn't interrupt the rodeo. They just pulled him to one side, finished the rodeo, and then when they had the group picture, they wanted to honor him. So they tied him on the donkey.
Are you serious? Okay, now we're looking at a picture. Let me describe this picture. We're looking at a picture that shows a big rodeo grounds, covered bleachers on one side, not covered on the other, and you've got cowboys in the front, and there's probably, I'm just going to guess, 70 cowboys here. And right in the middle of the picture, you've got a guy that looks like Mexican, but he says he was a rodeo clown sitting on a donkey. Everybody else is on really nice looking horses. And this guy's sitting on a donkey, and he says he's strapped on there because he's dead.
Well, then you can see somebody's holding him up behind.
Oh, yeah. He's hiding behind him, but you can see his hands on his shoulders. Well, I'm glad he got in the picture.
That might not happen today if you died during the rodeo.
I don't think it probably would, but that is, yeah, what did he die of?
Well, they don't know.
He
fell
died.
over.
He just fell over dead, and so they drug him off and then put him back on his
It
horse.
wasn't from an injury.
Wow, some kind of callous cowboys, huh?
Well, they didn't get too excited about dying. They just went on about their business.
That's too funny. I'm going to have to come back and take a picture of that and put that on the Facebook page.
This is a picture of the Lord's Supper. And someone in the hospital, the 1922 Veterans Hospital that was taken down a few years ago, someone had painted this on cloth in the dining room, and it covers a huge area. And they were able to transfer that to the theater.
Okay.
But you can't see that in the theater now, it's locked up. But this is just a picture of that painting.
And this one's different than what you normally see of the Last Supper.
A bit different.
Yeah, quite a bit different. But a very interesting picture. It's got Jesus, and instead of them all being seated on one side of the table like how they normally have it, the table is more of a U-shaped
it's a
table.
different interpretation.
Yes, I really like that.
This is a Coulter pine. When this was a fort, the parade ground was all dirt.
Okay.
But Bushnell, when he came as a physician, there was no medicine, but he believed in a holistic atmosphere. His background, undergraduate studies, had been in botany and Sanskrit, which is the Indian language.
Okay.
And he believed in a healing atmosphere, and he had trees imported from different areas. We've lost a lot of those trees due to lack of water, but these survived. This is a culture pine native to Southern California and Baja California.
Okay.
And you can see that tree, I'll show it to you out on the porch.
Right. I think I can see it right there.
If you look, that big tree there,
Uh-huh.
we've had that cord, and we think it was transplanted about 1905.
Oh, wow.
And you see that tree with the big base there,
Uh-huh.
still on the parade ground. That was brought here from India by Bushnell.
Wow.
And that was also in the early 1900s.
So he was using some natural type medicines at the time.
Well, and I think just to make the whole atmosphere holistic.
Okay.
Now, this is the tree this are the cones from the tree from India. Actually, this is just ossified, but it has very soft petals. We have a hard time getting those because the deer and the elk eat them as soon as they fall.
Kind of a delicacy, I guess.
Right.
Huh? Okay. And then this here's the parlor room.
Right. This is a picture of Pershing.
Okay.
You're familiar with General Pershing?
I just got an education out there on the porch.
And this was his first assignment out of West Point.
Right.
And he came back, he was disappointed because Geronimo had surrendered a few weeks before he got here. So he was consigned to developing, he had to help develop the telegraph system while he was here.
Okay.
What many people don't know about Pershing, in 1915, he was stationed in El Paso at Fort Bliss. He was planning to move his family to Fort Bliss, and they were in the Presidio in San Francisco, and his wife and 3 daughters perished in a house fire, and they all burned to death.
Really?
He had a son that survived. He came back to visit Fort Bayard quite a few times. He had a brother that had tuberculosis that was a patient here. And after he was a civilian, he came back to there was a Sojourners Club built by the Masons, and Pershing was a Mason, and it was built as a recreational facility for the soldiers, and he came back and drove a golden nail into the first beam to dedicate the Sojourners Club.
Wow.
So that's a little bit about our history with Pershing. Here is a picture of the 2 more best-known chaplains that were here.
Okay.
Chaplain Bateman was an Episcopalian chaplain during the time of the TB era.
Okay.
Chaplain Allensworth was here in the late 1800s and 1890s, 1888 to 1896. If you were a soldier here, you might be black, you might be white, you might be in the infantry, or you might be in the cavalry, but everyone in your company was of the same race. All the officers were white except Chaplain Allensworth. And the reason he was black was there was a regulation passed that black people could become chaplains and officers sooner than they could become line officers.
Okay.
He had been born a slave in Louisville, Kentucky in the 1840s. He learned to read when he was 9 years old. He was the youngest of about 9 children, and the master was so mad that he learned to read that he sold him out from under his mother. He was sold all the way down and up the Mississippi River. He was beat, he was starved.
Wow.
He underwent all kinds of trials and tribulation. He was in the stockades, he was sold on auction blocks. Somehow he survived, eventually got back to Louisville, Kentucky in 1863. He was still a slave. He saw his mother, and then he ran away and joined the Union Navy.
Okay.
And after that, he came back as a freedman to Louisville again. His mother was African Methodist Episcopal, which means she was a black Methodist.
Okay.
Allensworth was a black Baptist, and through the Northern Baptist Church, he was able to get some education. He got married, he buried his mother. He was more in administration and education, although he did pastor some black churches. Somebody told him that there was a regulation that black preachers could become chaplains in the army, and he asked if they knew anyone that might be interested, and he was interested himself. And he wrote a letter to Grover Cleveland, who was the president, asking to become a black chaplain. Wow. He was a Republican and Cleveland was a Democrat, but he said, if you appoint me, I'll acknowledge that the Democrats are making progress in terms of equality for black people, something to that effect.
Uh-huh.
And so he was not the first black chaplain in the military, but I think there was a second group of 4 people, and he was in that group.
Okay.
He came here. This is a picture of his wife, and she was a wonderful musician. He knew he was going to have to teach. The soldiers, white soldiers, didn't want to salute him. The white officers initially were not friendly. You can imagine.
Right,
He had a
right.
tough road. He wasn't authoritarian. He wasn't bitter. He just became their friends. And soon the white soldiers saluted him sooner than would the white officers.
Wow.
He had ecumenical services. As a Baptist, he didn't believe in infant baptism, but if he had a Catholic child born, he went and got the priest and they had a ecumenical service. He knew he was going to have to teach here, but he didn't realize he had so many black and some white soldiers that couldn't read. He wasn't overwhelmed, but he undertook to teach the black soldiers to read. And he wrote a pamphlet on adult literacy. By then they had railroads, and he became famous and went around to different posts in the West teaching adults how to teach adults to read. And
really?
That's his legacy.
Wow.
On his retirement, he was so well respected that he was the highest ranking chaplain discharged, not as, I shouldn't say the highest, as high as any white chaplains that were discharged.
That is a cool story. This must be the military room.
This has been made to look like a military room. Originally, this was where the ladies had their parlors.
Oh, okay.
And this was the men's room in the front, but the women had their, but we've made each of these rooms look a bit different.
Right, yeah, with different displays.
With different displays. This is a picture of the Rough Riders,
Okay.
and this is Theodore
I was going to
Roosevelt.
say, Theodore's sitting right up front, isn't he?
And this is a picture of their mascot, Josephine, which is a cougar or a mountain lion.
Right.
They weren't, this is 1898, they weren't able to take Josephine with them to Cuba. New Mexico's very proud that they had more Rough Riders than any other territory.
Okay. I did not realize that.
And Captain Luna was one of 3 Hispanic Rough Riders.
Okay, there's a lot of things around here with Luna's name. They're named after him?
Correct. Now, I don't know about Luna County, but the town of Los Lunas is named after his family.
You've also got another town that's just named Luna.
Yes, that's,
I mean, it's not much of a town. If you blink, you'd miss it, but...
and it was, for many years, it was an LDS community.
Okay.
but it was established, I think, by people from Los Lunas originally.
Okay.
But Luna was a famous land grant family in New Mexico, and the town of Los Lunas is named after his family.
Okay.
His family supported him coming into the U.S. Army because New Mexico was having difficulty becoming a state, and they felt like if they sacrifice their sons, so to speak, that it would show the loyalty of the Hispanic community to the United States.
Okay.
Unfortunately, Luna, although he survived the Battle of San Juan, was drowned in a rainstorm in the Philippines.
Oh, you've got another real interesting picture here. You've got a picture of Pershing with Pancho Villa. I'm assuming with the last name of Villa, it's Pancho.
That's Pancho Villa. That picture is taken in El Paso. And you see in the background is Lieutenant Patton.
Oh, really?
Who is a World War II
right.
general. He's very young there. Pancho Villa and Pershing originally were friends in El Paso, and Pancho Villa would come to El Paso because he particularly liked the ice cream in El Paso.
I like ice cream anywhere, so.
Originally, Woodrow Wilson supported Pancho Villa, but Pancho Villa lost some critical battles. So Woodrow Wilson changed his allegiance from Pancho Villa and started supporting Pancho Villa's opponent.
Okay.
And in addition to that, he gave his opposition permission to use the American Railroad that ran along the border at that time from El Paso through Columbus over to Douglas. And so Pancho Villa's opposition rode the train from El Paso over either to Douglas or near Douglas, and then went back into Mexico and annihilated Pancho Villa's men. And after that, Pancho Villa wasn't so friendly with the Americans.
Yeah, I would imagine that'd have something to do with it. Huh. Interesting picture.
This is a picture of the McClellan saddle.
Right. This isn't a picture of a McClellan. It is a McClellan.
It's a McClellan saddle.
Right.
Now, this is not original. This saddle is not original to Fort Bayard. It's been given to us by a reenactor.
Okay.
But this is the kind of saddle that was used here at Fort Bayard, except was painted brown originally. I think it's been repainted.
Okay.
This saddle with the hole down the middle doesn't seem comfortable at all, doesn't appear comfortable at all, but apparently it was. Not only was
I've heard a lot of people say that the McClellans are a very comfortable saddle.
it was used not only when this was a fort, but even after it became a tuberculosis hospital, they still use these saddles here some.
Oh, really? Okay.
Now, this is a picture of a typical soldier.
Again, this isn't a picture; it's a statue.
It's a
It's
statue.
a figurine. Yeah,
Yeah.
wearing the clothing.
And you can see that soldiers were not very large. Their weight was about 150 pounds maximum.
Right.
The average height of a soldier in the Civil War was about 5'4".
Wow.
In World War I may be a little off, it was about 5'6". In World War II, the average male's height was about 5'8". And now the average male's height maybe is 5'10". Although if you look at the basketball players,
Oh yeah.
they've always been tall. But even the football players, the ends, and the one that catches the passes, they look like giants.
Yeah, they do. They do.
So people are getting taller and taller and heavier and heavier.
What's amazing is just as a side note thing, you go to these old museums like the Buffalo Bill Museum.
Mm-hmm.
But you go to like the Buffalo Bill Museum and you hear all these stories about Buffalo Bill rode the Pony Express for hundreds of miles and did all these fantastic things. And you look at his clothing and it looks like he was probably about 5'4" and weighed about 100 pounds. And you're going, this guy did all these miraculous things as far as horse riding and all of that. And he just, in today's standards, you wouldn't think of him as being this monumental person.
No, people were much smaller.
Much
in
smaller.
general, not all, but in general.
Well, and then you look at the women's clothing and stuff too. You know, some of them women had what, 15-inch waists? And
Yes.
you're going, holy, and shoes that were like kids' shoes.
This is a picture of General Crook, always with that type of hat.
Okay.
He was the general in charge of the Chiricahua campaign for many years. He had an affinity for the Apaches, and it was his belief that it took an Apache to catch an Apache.
Okay.
And he hired Apaches. He hired up to 500 Apaches. Many of those were White Mountain Apaches to chase the Chiricahuas. Now, this Apache doesn't look like the rest of them.
Okay.
He's lighter complected.
Right.
He's the product of a Mexican lady south of San Carlos and an Irishman headed to the gold mines of California.
Okay.
And he was the product of that liaison. Later, he became a scout. He was happy-go-lucky and a bit mischievous, but a very, very good scout.
Uh-huh.
And someone asked what background he was, ethnic background, and they said, well, he's half Irish, half Mexican, and 100% son of a bitch.
No, I guess that describes him pretty well, doesn't it?
Later, his mother took up with a man by the name of Mr. Ward, and they had more children, and these were his half-siblings. He had red hair, and he was playing in the orchard one day, and he was kidnapped by the White Mountain Apaches and taken as hostage, and he was traded to a smaller tribe area and grew up as an Apache. He understood Apache and Spanish, but he didn't understand English. And his Apache name became Mickey Free. Somehow, when the Apaches were sent to Florida, he escaped that, and he remained in this area and lived out his life in this area.
Wow.
Not exactly right here in this area, but more in southeast Arizona.
Okay. Yeah, I've heard that name for some reason. Okay, so now we go upstairs.
Now we go upstairs.
And this building has 3 floors in it,
It
correct?
does. And besides that, there's a basement,
Oh,
which,
I'm gonna go with you upstairs.
okay.
Ooh,
Let's go. All of these rooms were bedrooms, but we've made them look like other rooms.
right. And how many bedrooms were there? 5?
There's 5 on this floor and 2 more upstairs.
Oh, wow. And this one here you've got set up as kind of a school room. You've got some desks in here and a map and a bell.
And a
A
bell.
school bell.
yes.
The most interesting thing about this room is the picture.
Okay.
This is a picture of the schoolroom in central New Mexico, which is about 2 miles from here.
Okay.
Clara.
But it's now Santa Clara. But
Right.
the interesting thing, the Buffalo soldiers didn't just come and go, but they left their imprint.
Right.
And in this school, you can see integration and a combination of blacks, whites, and Hispanics.
Yeah. There's the whole gamut of color there. It's a black and white picture, but you can see all kinds of different shades.
Some of these kiddos almost look like they're Native Americans.
I would assume that there probably are some in
Yeah,
here.
they're a mixed group.
That is a very neat picture of the school in Central right after 1900.
Wow. And there's probably 100 kids, maybe a little bit more.
Maybe. I would say 70.
Somewhere. It's quite a few, but like you said, there's
And then 2 female teachers and a guy supervisor. And the old adobe, look at those bricks.
Yeah.
That was
Is
forever.
that school still there, or is that school
No,
gone?
no.
The school's gone.
Yeah. Now, there's another neat thing here.
Let me kind of get a microphone to you so you can hear.
Okay, this is a pencil box honoring Lindbergh. Charles Lindbergh flew over Fort Bayard in the 1920s after going to Paris
Oh, really?
and dropped off pencils to all of the patients that could get outside.
Now, did he land here, or did
No,
he just threw them out the window?
Just dropped them off.
And this is a tin. Was this tin part of his droppings, or?
Just fun. No, this
Okay.
was just in an antique shop.
Okay.
But he went on to Lordsburg,
Okay.
New Mexico. And John could tell you about the airport.
Well, he went on to Lordsburg to land. Lordsburg had a better airport than we did here at the time.
Okay.
There was 2 airports in New Mexico.
Only 2?
Only 2.
Okay.
One up north and one at Lordsburg.
Okay.
You can believe at Lordsburg.
Well, and I haven't been to. Yes, I drove through Lordsburg. It's not very big.
No, it's not.
Just drive through.
Right. Wow.
One of my patients managed the airport in Lordsburg,
Okay.
but I don't think he was a manager at that time. But he and his wife married, they eloped and married. She was 19, had just finished high school. They lived in a cave their first year, and he tried to mine bat guano out of a cave, and she let him down and up on a pulley rope every day.
Yeah, a lot of trust. I bet he didn't piss her off before he went to work, did he?
They lived to be 101 and 105.
Really? And they were your patients?
They were not that they ever came to the doctor very much.
Oh, okay. I was going to say you must have done something right for them.
But they were married 82 years.
Wow.
And they got an award for being the longest married couple in America. By the time she died, I retired. But my son was working at the hospital, and he came home one night and said, Miss Kuykendall just died. I said, you've just destroyed the longest marriage in America.
They probably even got an honorable mention on Paul Harvey. He always had his longest married couple feature. Yeah.
This is made to look like a medical room.
Uh-huh.
And here is a picture of 2 nurses and 2 doctors poised to go hunting.
It looks like it. Yeah. But the women are carrying the guns, so the guys don't appear as though they're hunting. It looks like the women are hunting.
This picture is staged. The women came here as nurses, and you see they had to wear ankle-length uniforms.
Right.
But they adapted to Fort Bayard very well. Fort Bayard was one of the earlier forts to have nurses. And one of the nurses at Fort Bayard, Dida Kinney, was appointed the first superintendent of the Army Nursing Corps.
Oh, really?
Before,
1901.
before that, the nurses were attached to the medical corps, but she became the first Army Nursing Corps superintendent.
Huh.
And the nurses were contract nurses. They weren't really in the military.
Okay.
You could have a male medic, but a female was a contract nurse.
Okay.
Now, they did have a great benefit when the soldiers left Fort Bayard, 1899. They had to leave all of the horses at Fort Bayard.
Oh.
The horses became the nurses' horses. So they could ride on free time. They could go on extended rides up to the cliff dwellings.
Okay.
4 days, 2 days up, 2 days back. And if the patients were well enough, this might be a motive to do what you're told to do, eat what you're supposed to eat, then you would also get to ride horses.
So the horses were bribes, but what a good way to do it.
Yeah. And obviously if they've been a cavalry horse for 20 years,
Right.
they're not going to be one to throw you off.
Wow.
This is a wheelchair of the time. It's not original to Fort Bayard. But they still had the same kind of wheelchairs when I became an orderly in 1962.
Really?
But I never saw one, the wooden part was the same, but I never saw one that had the pot in the bottom. And I can't imagine that was too comfortable.
Okay, now we're looking at a chair, old wheelchair that's got oak seat, oak leg pieces, oak armrests. Looks just like your typical old wheelchair, but there's a bedpan sitting down below a hole, so it's almost more like you're in a wheelchair outhouse combo. It's about the dangest looking wheelchair I've ever seen in my life. That is really unusual. I've never seen one with the hole cut out like that. Like you said, it seems like it'd get kind of uncomfortable at some point in time. But you must not have been wearing your pants when you were sitting on it either.
Evidently not.
Maybe it was an emergency one to get you down the hall to where the actual bathroom was before. Yeah, I don't know. You've got a artificial leg over here, some different instruments that are in cabinets. You've got an old hospital bed.
The Johnson & Johnson bandage.
Oh yes, cabinet, first aid headquarters.
If you were a patient here with tuberculosis, you had to spit in a cup, something like this, and if you were caught spitting on the floor or otherwise, you were punished. And then this was taken to the crematorium every night and burned.
Okay, now what he's holding is a little cardboard box. I assume that it had a lid on it of some sort or another. And it says Sanit's Spuck Taste. So it was your spit tune. And,
Correct.
And then they would take that every night to the crematory and burn
Correct.
it. Wow.
And if you go out on this road, paved road, walk all the way, you can see the base of the 1885 hospital. It wasn't actually the base of the hospital, but the retaining wall for the hospital. Okay. And if you look in the distance, you can see one of those crematoriums, and you can walk down to it and see it.
Okay. I might have to do that. Now, back in you hear that there's laws that aren't useful anymore or anything, and I've heard spitting on the sidewalk or spitting in public used to be a crime or a punishable offense. And I'm assuming it's because of the TB and the spit from a TB patient or whatever was pretty contagious.
Yes. tuberculosis is transported primarily by one person who is infected with tuberculosis coughing on another person within a short range. But at the time, the feeling was that there were TB germs in spits that stayed and that they were still contagious even though they hit the floor and so forth.
Okay.
And that kind of thinking went away for a period, but now they have reestablished that it actually is possible, for instance, in planes, for the TB germs to circulate within the plane.
Okay.
And they have done studies, for instance, in the ventilators, and they placed guineas up in the openings at the top of the rooms, and they found that the TB germs can wind up in the guinea pigs up some distance away. So maybe that thinking wasn't wrong to start with. But most TB, I think, was caused by pretty close transmission.
Okay, now we're coming into Dr. Bushnell's office.
This was Dr. Bushnell's. He was the commander here. And this furniture is all original to Fort Bayard.
Okay. We've got a desk and a table and some typewriters.
Bushnell brought the Underwood typewriter. And before that, the records were handwritten. And after Bushnell came, the records were typed.
Okay.
And this is a weighing machine. Now, when the early 1900s, there weren't a lot of bona fide real medicines. The only real medicines were morphine, chloroform, ether, digitalis leaf, quinine bark, and mercury treated for syphilis.
Okay.
But these are machines to weigh the medicine, and this is the kind of machine they used.
It looks a lot like a scale, but
It does.
But-
I'm sorry, did I say machine? This is a scale
okay.
for weighing medicine.
Okay. And then you got some old medical books.
Bushnell wrote quite a bit.
Oh, really?
He wrote a book about tuberculosis in the black race. He published a lot in the Journal of the American Medical Association, has some original articles in that around 1900. But these are some of the books that he used.
Okay.
And I have some of his books at home.
Wow. Okay. Now we come into, ooh, I like this table. We've got a table that's probably 5 foot round and has a big map in the middle of it, kind of decoupaged over the top of, that shows all of the area here.
And this shows the Warm Springs Apaches, the Membrano Apaches, Faywood Hot Springs, and if you look long enough, you can see Fort Bayard. Here's Bayard.
Right.
And here's Silver City.
And there's Fort Bayard right there.
That's Fort Bayard right there.
Yep. That's pretty cool, having the table with the map in the middle of it. I really like that.
There was a record of the weather kept here at Fort Bayard from 1866, about 1866, 1867, until 1992, and even until they moved the hospital in 2010.
Wow.
And this was kept by the government, and the Department of Interior has indicated that they would bring that equipment back here and train us to use it, but the catch is that somebody has to volunteer we have to have volunteers to read those machines every day.
Oh, that makes it a little bit difficult. Then you've got a little arrowhead.
Pieces of pottery that have been brought here. We don't
Right.
have any intact pottery.
Okay. Then we come on across and we got another room that is kind of set up as a bedroom or
Soldier's room. This is what we think a soldier's room would have looked like. And you see a deck of cards. In addition,
grooming kit.
right. In addition, this is a heliograph.
Okay. Tell me about the heliograph.
This is a British machine. We thought when we purchased this that it was an American machine, but an American machine only has one mirror.
Okay.
But the telegraph came to Fort Bayard in 1877.
Okay.
And it wasn't terribly effective because the Native Americans learned to cut the telegraph machine and splice it so that you couldn't easily tell where it had been cut.
Okay.
If you go that direction, you can see some of the old telegraph poles.
Okay.
But when they got the trains with the telegraph machine, then it became possible to send messages very quickly. But they got the heliograph machines going very well, but it was very close to the end of the Native American Wars. So for a short time, it was effective. But they were able to place these machines about 30 or 40 miles apart and send messages through southwest New Mexico, southeast Arizona, and even northern Mexico over an area of several hundred miles by having these placed maybe every 30 or 40 miles.
And what these are is they're mirrors that
Right.
reflect the sun, so you could do Morse code by tilting or
Right.
adjusting your flash, much like what you would if you had a piece of magnifying glass or something and
Right.
you were shining it into somebody's eye.
But it took quite a bit of training. You have soldiers that can't read.
Right.
You have to teach them the alphabet. You have to teach them to read. You have to teach them the Morse code. You have to teach them to work these mirrors such that it interprets the Morse code.
Right.
And you have to teach them to adjust the mirrors throughout the day to get the proper reflection from the sun. But once, it wasn't easy.
I was going to say, it took a little bit of skill to figure that one out.
Not everybody could do it.
I'll bet.
But it did eventually become very helpful in 1884 and 1885, right at the end of the Native American Wars. They were able to set these up in some of the mining towns like Kingston and Hillsboro, for example, and they could send messages, Indians approaching or this.
Right.
They didn't write love letters, but they could send a short message of imminent danger.
Right. Right. Wow.
This is a picture of Walter Loving.
Okay.
He was not an officer here, but an enlisted soldier. He was in charge of the band and was very good. He was so good that the band by that time was on loan to other places, sometimes Santa Fe.
Oh, really?
He was in the Cuban War, and then he went to the Philippines, married a Filipino lady, and was in the Philippine Constabulary military, which was a branch of the American military by that time. And his band played for Taft's inauguration, I believe.
Oh, wow.
He was still in the military in the Philippines, by this time an officer, when the Philippines were overrun by the Japanese.
Okay.
He gave 50 years, almost 50 years of service to his country.
As a band director the whole time, or?
Much of the time, but not. I don't think he was a band director all the time. He was an officer by this time.
And again, he was a black soldier.
He was a black soldier.
Wow.
And unfortunately, when the Americans retook the Philippines, he was killed by the Japanese.
Oh, that's not a good ending. Okay. And now I guess we go up to the next floor.
Yeah, here's one more thing. Baseball was a big thing at Fort Bayard.
Okay.
Particularly in the TB and veterans area. And in the late 19-teens, the Chicago White Sox were playing for the World Series.
Right.
Some of those players took bribes to throw the World Series to the other team.
Okay.
And they were tried. None of them went to jail, but they were kicked out and they were not able to play in the National Leagues again.
Okay.
And they were called the Black Sox. And two of those Black Sox came to Fort Bayard to play semi-pro ball.
Really? Right here?
Right here. Fort Bayard had a semi-pro team during that period, and they played places like El Paso, Tucson, Deming, but also several teams in Mexico. People didn't worry about crossing the border then. They just went back and forth. And it was a big thing. The patients, the TB patients, if they were able, went to the games. If they weren't able, originally they had runners that went back and forth. But later, they got headphones and they could listen through the headphones to the games.
Okay.
They were allowed to bet on the games within a limited amount.
Did they know who they were betting with? The Black Sox. It wouldn't have been such a good deal. Okay, now we're up here on the third floor.
Right here is the original circuit breaker for the house. This house was built with electricity.
Really? Wow.
There's two things, really important things to see.
Okay.
And one is the bathroom.
Okay.
The commode is not original, but the bathtub and the sink are original to the building when it was built.
And the bathtub is a clawfoot, and the sink has some big pedestals holding up the front and some pretty heavy-duty plumbing underneath, too.
Right.
And the commode just looks like a commode.
The commode is not
right.
But if it had been original, you would have reached up above.
And had a gravity flow tank up there.
And notice the wood here, how the original 2x4s were truly 2x4s.
I was going to say it's all rough cut, heavy 2x4s. Yes, sir. Wow,
And
what a
this is
bottle collection.
Many people have brought bottles back, but one family in particular has given us a lot of these bottles. We've had a glass archaeologist look at this, hoping that some of them went back to when it was a fort, but they don't.
Oh, most of these are medical type bottles and stuff.
Correct.
It looks like. Yes.
And this is a storage space.
Okay.
These homes, this was the commander's home. And all this row were officers' quarters.
Okay.
And there were semi-duplexes and quadruplexes. By the time it became a state hospital, however, the caste system had pretty well broken down. So many times the families with the most children got to live in some of these bigger houses.
Okay.
There's one family that came here, and they lived maybe in the 1960s. I'm not sure of the year, maybe 1970s. And they lived with their 8 children in one of those little houses, tiny houses that you see coming in.
Uh-huh.
But they moved to one of the houses on this and had half of the building for their 8 children. and they didn't have much money, so they poached deer and stored them up in the attic here.
Well, you got to eat, right? Okay, and this room here looks like a kid's room.
This is made, now the Bushnells did not have any little children, but this has been made to look like a child's bedroom.
You got a big teddy bear and a bassinet and a crib.
And wooden toys.
Yeah, dominoes and Chinese checkers and
And
Lincoln
here you can
logs.
see a nice picture or a nice view of the kneeling nun. Do you see that?
Uh-huh, yep, I do.
And the kneeling nun is on, of course, has gone through ownership with different copper companies, and they probably would have liked to have taken that down, but it has such a religious significance to this area.
Right.
Anytime that it's looked like that it's appear that they're going to take that kneeling nun down, there's a hue and a cry. So
there's good time for that, isn't there?
The kneeling nun now is actually wired there where it cannot be taken down.
Oh, wow. And then this room here looks to be more of a ladies' room.
This is made to look like an officer's wife's room.
Right.
And the idea is that her bags had to be packed where she would have to leave with 24 hours notice if necessary.
Okay, and you've got a steamer trunk here. You've got several undergarments placed on a bed. You've got a lady that's dressed over there in her clothes and dressers and all of that kind of stuff.
One interesting
little room.
thing is toward the end of World War II, there were German prisoners of war that were sent here from the Lordsburg camp, and there were about 100.
Okay.
And they did much of the work that the civilians would normally do in World War II. And if you walk to the end of this block and up 2 blocks, you can see on the cornerstone of one of the sidewalks, the corner sidewalk, it says POW 1946.
Really? Now we've been to.
I'll take you down there if you like.
Oh, maybe here a little bit later. Yeah, when we finish up, that'd be great. We've been to a couple of different places that had POW camps, and that's something that I just became aware of probably 5 years ago, that we actually had German and Italian prisoners of war all over the United States. So
in Lordsburg, they had both German prisoners of war and Italian. I think the Italians first and then the Germans. And some of them were on loan and worked up here at Fort Bayard and were paid to work here toward the end and after World War II.
Really? Okay, well, John, I think I'm going to go ahead and finish up my podcast here. This has been great. Doug taking us through, you taking us through, and Ansel. I appreciate you guys taking the time to spend with me. And this is such a cool site. Driving in here is just a real experience coming down the road. But the way I finish out my podcast is I say the world is full of wonder. People need to get out and explore, see some of this stuff because it is so cool. And everybody have an absolutely wonder-filled day.
All the roll and go, where am I to go? Meet Johnny, where am I to go? For I'm a young and a sailor lad, and where am I to go?